Okay, let's talk a little bit about ethnography. And I will tell you that I'm approaching this with some trepidation because it brings up feelings of imposter syndrome. I don't really think I'm especially qualified to talk about it. I haven't done serious ethnography. Now, that said, I have a great deal of respect for a number of ethnographers in this field. That is, those who ethnographies in more digital or technologically mediated spaces. I absolutely respect the years that they put into doing the work that they do and the deep understanding of those spaces that they work in. And on the other side of this, I've seen pieces published or at least or presented or submitted that start out by saying that they're doing an ethnography, and then when they describe their fieldwork, they basically showed up somewhere for an afternoon and decided that what they were going to, they called this an ethnographic practice. And that's not very good work. And it's not very believable. And so that's my problem with ethnography, is that on the one hand, I think that there's really outstanding work, and on the other, there's really bad work, and it's all called ethnography in some way. That you don't have to have an ethnography license. Now, that said, I had lunch, this is more than a decade, maybe even more than 2 decades ago, with an ethnographer named Tom Belsdorf. And he's a very well-known anthropologist at UC Irvine, and has worked in virtual spaces and that sort of thing. And so I kind of explained to him this, which is, I'm not an ethnographer. He was like, he was interested in my work, and I was like, yes, but I'm not an ethnographer. And I talked to him about some of the things I do. And he kind of disabused me of this notion. And this is someone who, again, moved to Indonesia for several years to do some of his work. This is someone who's very serious about what it means to do ethnography, and was at the time the editor of one of the main anthropology journals. He said, no, if you are going into this with the right mindset, and if you're thinking about some of the serious reflective nature of what you do, and if you are really immersing yourself within these spaces, then you are an ethnographer. And so there's no reason to be afraid of that term, of doing this kind of participant observation. That is ethnography, when you're doing participant observation. And so I think I don't know if he was just being nice, or if it was a deeper kind of engagement. I think he's a very good teacher in this area as well. And so I was impressed by that idea, which is that, yes, you have to do it well, but it's still a method. It's just a method that often you have to invest more time in than you would other kinds of approaches, I think. At least to do well, you do. So ethnography isn't simply a research method in the way that some of these others are. It's a way of knowing social worlds. It's often described as the practice of participant observation, but really ethnography is about a slow, situated understanding of a particular site or a particular social field. It's a commitment to learning how a community makes sense of itself by becoming a part of that community and spending sustained time with its everyday practices and interacting with a variety of the people working in that space. Historically, ethnography comes out of anthropology, of course, and particularly from early studies of small-scale and indigenous societies. Early ethnographers would usually be leaving from, a colonial power out into the colonies. And I guess certainly it was a step up from what had happened before, which was just making assumptions about primitive man, right? And instead, it was a bit revolutionary in that they were going to these places and living with these people. And some of the early anthropological work out of this really kind of erased some of the assumed stories about what happened among primitives, right? So I don't want to discount that kind of work, but it really was people coming often from a developed nation or from a colonizer out to the periphery to do that work. Now, over the last century or so, ethnography has moved out of exclusively anthropological studies, and it's now used in a wide range of the social sciences: sociology, media studies, human-computer interaction, information studies. It's a kind of one of the core methodologies you find in science and technology studies more broadly: human-computer interaction, and even into things like organizational research or organizational psychology and business practice, things like that, where you kind of embed yourself within organizations as well as within kind of social milieu. And like many of the methods we've been talking about, ethnographic approaches have been imported into user experience. This is kind of the STS and user experience spaces are kind of shoulder to shoulder. We should probably talk about that a little bit at some point, that a lot of these methods we're talking about it from the context of someone who's a social scientist trying to create generalizable knowledge. But all of them can be employed in fairly strategic and tactical ways within businesses, within other organizations, within governmental agencies, kind of across the board. And I think user experiences, people who do work in user experience, for a number of reasons, one of which is that a lot of people leave the academy to go into user research, but they often draw some of these approaches from across the social sciences to better understand how users are interacting with various systems. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about what ethnography is, what it distinguishes it from some of the other methods we've been talking about, how it adapts to these digital and online environments. What is it? What's the difference between ethnography and virtual ethnography, or are they the same thing? How ethnography can be used to study especially socio-technical systems, including platforms, algorithms, infrastructures, and how contemporary technologies can support the ethnographic work itself. So what makes ethnography different from some of the other approaches we've talked about, particularly different from some of the approaches we're about to talk about in terms of looking at texts? And I think if doing a work on, say, trace data is at one end of things, ethnography, in those cases, it relies on distance between the observer and the subject. On the other side of things is ethnography, where it really, instead of abstracting these individuals into data, it really causes the investigator to become a part of that data. Big data analytics for patterns across millions of different traces. Ethnography is smaller and works through kind of proximity and immersion within these environments. So ethnographers ask questions like, how do people understand what they're doing, right? What meanings do they attach to their tools, to their routines, to their relationships? What norms are enforced implicitly and explicitly? Like, what are the informal networks as well as the formal networks of control? What tensions, contradictions, or workarounds shape everyday practices? We learn a lot in our field, especially, about the kind of ways in which informal practices are shaped by the people who use them, and in turn how the people that use them shape those practices. And a lot of that is really hard to get at unless you are engaged in participant observation, unless you are right there alongside someone and understanding how they're doing it, and in many cases doing it yourself. Ethnographic knowledge is contextual rather than universal. It's interpretive rather than explanatory, and it's process-oriented rather than outcome-oriented. All this means that ethnography is a way of knowing about a social system or site, but it runs into some issues that we would not normally associate with a scientific process or an objective process. It can't be objective. It is highly interpretive. That is, the investigator, him or herself, they are the instrument of measurement, right? They are immersing themselves in this space, and so they become the instrument, and therefore it cannot be especially objective. And beyond that, it's really hard to generalize whatever you find during this long and deep investigation. You're studying a system that is complex, where meaning and power are kind of entangled with practice. And that's true both of online spaces and offline spaces. And of course, those are not distinct, the overlap between the two. So that makes generalizability very, very difficult. You can, and among ethnographers, they will usually make no claim to generalizable knowledge. And I think there's sometimes a little bit of a disappearing act there, right? I mean, if you look at some of the folks like Marcel, early anthropologists or social scientists or sociologists, people like Marcel Mauss or Durkheim or others, often what they're doing is they're taking ethnographic reports and then trying to make them generalizable, right? So they're the ones using. Mauss is the big example here, using Malkowski and others' actual field work. Mauss didn't really go out and do a lot of this field work to kind of make broad claims about large scale social facts, right? And so it can be done, and it has been done. Ethnographers often will kind of back up of that because they are very much committed to the idea that this is knowledge within a particular context. But if so, then why are you interested in it? And so that shift, it's not quite generalizability. It is more like a pattern that might arise, or kind of the just so story that you can take from it. And so that process of saying, okay, what of this is useful beyond this particular context can be a little bit fraught. So part of this move from the long history of ethnography is from immersing oneself in a physical site and moving out to immersing yourself in a virtual site. I will note that this is almost never entirely virtual. Like I'm sure there are people who have done this. In fact, I know there are, but most of the good ethnographers are not doing it solely from their basement. Often they are combining sites that are physical with sites that are virtual. That said, the traditional form of ethnography usually talked about sort of a bounded field site, like you would talk about, a village or a school or a laboratory if you were going and looking at a lab or a workplace, maybe even a town. The ethnographer actually traveled to the field, lived there and worked there in order to kind of immerse themselves in that. But when the field is not easily bound by physical borders? What if it's a subreddit or a Discord server or a multiplayer game? Or a lot of this was done in Second Life, a virtual space, or a fandom that might be across multiple platforms, people kind of interacting across those platforms, and the same group of people moving throughout them. An algorithmically curated feed, or even something that would be a physical space, but it's and this is going to become increasingly an interesting kind of field for doing ethnography. What happens when you are overlaying that physical space with augmented reality? And that can mean what we think of as augmented reality, the glasses, and seeing things that other people can't see. But we're already augmenting our reality using, the things in our pockets, the phone, and other kinds of electronic, watches and rings, and all of the other kinds of things that we kind of create a cloud around us with. And so, that doesn't feel like a strictly virtual ethnography, but a lot of the components of it make bounding that site a lot harder. We can see this even in things like, if you're in a workplace, it used to be you were in a workplace and you were doing an ethnography of that workplace, but a lot of the people in that workplace are now splitting their focus and their attention to things outside of it, to home, to talking to their kids, whatever. And a lot of the people in that workplace are talking to people at home or working from home. And so, it becomes very interpenetrated, and it's very hard to have a physical boundary. And so you have to think a little bit more about what the boundaries of that site would be. It's not just kind of doing ethnography online, that's part of it, but you have to really rethink that question of what it means to be present and proximate. Proximity in a physical space is easy. I'm literally close to you. But what does it mean to be kind of immersed in a space if it's online? How do you participate in that space? There's lots of different codes for participation in online spaces, offline too, but how do you kind of engage in that? And what does observing mean in that context? And so that it does kind of change the structure of things in really somewhat complicated ways. We've had tens of thousands of years to understand what the basic physical structure of interaction is in physically bounded spaces, but these are so plastic and so easily changed that we have to kind of reorient ourselves to what it means to be in these spaces with other people. Key questions lay in this issue of where is that space, and where does the community, if you're studying, for example, a community, where does that community exist, right? Like communities actually literally going back, even 20 or 30 years, if you talked about communities, you could put boundaries around it. We were talking neighborhoods. So, you could say where the end of the community was. And so now that's been an ongoing question about whether virtual communities are really a reasonable thing. And I have to say, even just this afternoon, I was talking to a graduate student who was trying to tackle this. I tried to tackle it. I teach the communities course. I'm very interested in communities, and I could not tell you what they are. This is one of those things where it is a very open question, and these new kinds of mediation of that community make it especially hard. Is it tied to a platform? Does it move across them? A lot of the work people do is in platforms, but a lot of the way people actually think about communities and their structure is trans platform. What counts as participation, right? Is lurking participation? If you just like things, is that enough? Do you have to have some kind of reciprocal relationship? And then how do the platform rules and algorithms and those sorts of things, how do they shape what can be seen or said? So in a physical environment, you have that, right? In a classroom, you can move chairs and tables around. In an office, you could talk about the differences between offices that are open space and not, offices that may, where in the office people sit, who has the corner office, who, et cetera, right? You can talk about those things, but those are far more dynamic and difficult to sense in some ways and might look different to different participants in an online space. So just, basically the short end of this is it's complicated, right? That moving it is not just saying, oh, I'm doing ethnography. Oh, now I'm doing ethnography online. Now I'm on a horse. It's a matter of kind of recalibrating yourself to the extreme differences of this constructed space, right? Importantly, those online spaces, there was a time when we would say IRL in real life as opposed to online. I think IRL has dropped off. I think people purposefully did that at some point. You saw a shift, I think, during the late 1990s, early 2000s from IRL. I'd be curious to hear what you think about this, but I think you still see IRL once in a while. But you also see, especially from people who are terminally online, AFK, away from keyboard, and other things like that, right? So, or maybe that's disappearing entirely. But it's worth saying that online interactions are real. If you've been in one of my other courses, I've talked quite a bit about this meet space versus social space and online space a distinction, and we talk about that a lot in the communities course as well. But the spaces that are social spaces online are just as real as the ones that are in physical spaces. They have different dimensions to them. They have different forms of power, but they're still real spaces, and so they're real. But they are also differently real. And so I think that honestly, the best way that we are going to understand that they are differently real is not by looking at big data and by having kind of robust, reliable measures, but it is going to be this deeply textured, thick description of these heavily social environments. And if you want to see where a great deal of ethnography is happening now, it really is around these socio-technical systems. This is, if you go to an STS conference or something, the method of choice will be either virtual or non-virtual, and again, that distinction is hard, ethnographic investigation, right? The socio-technical system, if you haven't encountered this in other courses, is basically one in which social relationships and technical artifacts are inseparable. And if that sounds like it is ubiquitous, it is, right? There is no, and this is, I think we're coming to this understanding that we may not have had before, which is that has always been the case, right? It's certainly the case now. You can't separate our social relationships from our technological relationships. But now that we see that in such obvious ways now, it's clear that we've always been cyborgs, that we've always had this technological piece that mediated our interactions. They weren't always electronic, but we've always had that technical piece. These kind of technological factors shape visibility and obscurity, how well you can see other people and under what conditions, attention and neglect. I think that the most important thing for us to be studying now, and certainly since about the mid-1970s, is the question of attention, how it's shaped, how it's disciplined the technologies of attention. That is a big piece of when you're looking at these environments. What do the technological elements do to the way in which we can attend to things or choose to attend to things? Questions of power, authority, marginalization, who gets a role, who gets a say, and what behaviors are rewarded, discouraged, or rendered moot or impossible or unacceptable, right? This is everything from banning to shadow banning, algorithmic processes that do that, but also just the technical means of doing that. As I noted before, I've looked at things like how upvotes and downvotes change the behavior of people in the system. Certainly how algorithmic processes might be shaping how we see the world, not just in that space or on that platform, but more broadly. Whether brain rot is a real thing. It is. How these systems might change the way we cognitively engage with the world. All of these are questions that kind of are engaged in socio-technical systems, and that are often best engaged through ethnography. Sorry, I got a little distracted there speaking of attention, because I'm thinking I had mentioned the brain rot piece, and I have seen some recent sets of experiments. And so, I think you get at these often through the ethnography, and then when you want to get to something that's more generalizable, you can move into more traditional. I guess ethnography is quite traditional, but more quantitative, more generalizable methods that allow you to kind of tease out the things that you have discovered through that ethnographic process. When you look at a community that's online and you're taking that ethnographic approach, you're never just looking at kind of the people, right? You're always including things like the interfaces that mediate their interactions, the algorithms that do the same, moderation systems, metrics, feedback loops, the basic infrastructural and sometimes sort of legal and sort of agreements that help to shape that as well, which is kind of between the technology and the people. You're looking at all of those things as well. I think one of the reasons I'm so enamored by ethnographers is that they reach these insights by living the life of the people in them. So if I think about someone like Mimi Ito, who I worked with for a little bit at the University of California at Irvine, and her work on kind of understanding how kids make use of technology and interact with one another, she did that and learn to create with it and become creative communities. She did that by living within those creative communities and interacting a lot with those kids and kind of directly engaging with that process. Like, this is not just her supposition or her observation. It is kind of being deeply involved in those communities over a period of many years, along with a number of other ethnographers that worked with her. Like, this was she ended up collaborating with people in lots of different contexts, which was one way to kind of get towards a little bit of generalizability by having so many different stories from so many different places all around the world in different contexts. Or someone like Biela Coleman, who spent, I don't know what the total time was, but it was well over a year with Anonymous, the hacking group, the collective. And to understand how Anonymous worked and the power structures within that, and some of their what might from the outside seem very ambiguous, and also maybe from the inside, ambiguous kinds of goals. I mean, these are kind of, I mentioned before, one of my heroes, but these are my current kind of peer heroes, the people that are doing really interesting work. And I'm slightly jealous that I'm not jealous of the time they have to put in to do that research, but I am jealous of them being able to live the lives and experience the lives that they're then able to describe in much more detail than I can, in much more sort of nuanced detail than I'm able to from the outside, if that makes sense. Now, I will say that, ethnography is not the only way to do that, but it can be very difficult to know what to study until you have that experience of participating in them. So I will say that even if you're not using this as your method, if you want to study the effects of moderation, you better have acted as a moderator in a particular platform for a while. If I want to understand why people become griefers in Second Life. Griefers is people who mess with other players in a game. And so, why do people do that? What's wrong with you? Why would you do that? Why do you mess with the things other people have created? Or in Minecraft, it has the same kind of thing. Why would you do that? And how do you do that? And how do you link up with other people who do that? And if why would you make friends with someone who does that? To understand that, you better have kind of you can't just assume it from the outside. You better have talked to some of these people and maybe even kind of figured out how they interact and that sort of thing, right? So you need to kind of become some of this for a while if you want to be able to know what the right questions are to ask. That's not necessarily a full ethnography, and you may not even want to write up a full ethnography, and you don't have to spend a year with people to do that. But I think we can all be a little bit ethnographers, even if we don't want to use that term, and even if we don't end up using it as an overall method. I think that we often will sneak in a little bit of that, and then backstop it with some other methodological approach. Especially with heavily mediated social spaces, the step from ethnography to kind of socio-technical, traditional ethnography within physical spaces to socio-technical systems didn't just look at technology as a mediator or as something that maybe structured the spaces, but as something like an actor. And that came about with an approach called actor network theory, which I think had its heyday and is now dying off. But what it did is kind of had an influence on how people engaged in these kinds of investigations moving forward. Actor network theory, the simplest version of this is that you posit that non-human entities can also be treated as actors within a social system. So it's a systems-based approach with the thought that we interact not only with each other kind of mediated by communication technologies, but that those technologies themselves can be actors. Certainly when we get to things like artificial agents, that seems obvious, right? But actor network theory was not working at a time when we had artificial agents in that sense. So, a gauge can be an agent or a work board. Like if you have something that's a board where you're recording things and you have what we have to do next or something in an environment where you're working collaboratively, that board can be treated as something of an actor. And it doesn't mean that these things necessarily have intentional actions, right? It doesn't mean that they are like humans and that they have a plan and motivations and emotions. It just means that they are able to affect other parts of the system in various ways. They can enable certain actions of other actors, both humans and non-human. They can constrain the actions of others. They can mediate the relationships between other elements in this system. They can stabilize or destabilize certain social arrangements or structures. So it's largely kind of thinking about these things as more than just mediators, right? So, from that perspective, something like a recommendation algorithm or a moderation algorithm or a group of moderators, those are kind of interchangeable. Even something like a like button or a database schema or a report. All of these are actually participating in shaping social outcomes, and kind of we treat them as actors because of that. It lets us kind of follow the connections between all of these things rather than thinking about boundaries or structures. It lets us think about agency, right? As I said, the human actors in this case may have a certain level of agency, or that may be restricted in some ways by other actors within the environment. And it lets us kind of think about where things break down. In a lot of cases, you're looking at why, again, the problem-solving issue. Why isn't this unit working the way it's supposed to? If you're looking at people interacting on the bridge of a ship, for example, when do we see failure in there, and can we trace the ways in which each of the actors may have participated in either overcoming that failure or contributing to it? In virtual ethnographies, this often means not just looking at what people say they're doing, but kind of how their actions co-produce outcomes through platforms, through tools, through the kinds of other pieces that are contributing to this process. And I will just add this as a side note. So actor network theory, ANT, is often closely associated with Bruno Latour. I actually backed off of it for a while because it didn't seem very helpful for the things I was doing. And I think Latour later on, after it had hit part of its heyday as being a popular kind of phrase to use, or it's not a very concrete thing. It's really just a slight adjustment in how you consider the non-human actors in a space. He did say he wished he hadn't called it actor network theory, because it's not a theory, right? It's really a methodological tweak to think about a network of actants. It doesn't really tell you, it doesn't explain anything or predict anything. It's an approach to modeling a space. So the theory part of it is weird for something that isn't really a theory, but hey, it's stuck with the name. So we've talked a lot about ethnography and virtual ethnography without actually saying how you do it. And as I said, most of you won't be doing it, but even if you're doing it in a small way, we can think about it. The traditional pieces that you would see in participant observation is prolonged engagement, which is why you're probably not going to be doing it. Careful observation, what's called thick description, which I think we've already hit before, and reflexive field notes. So those things tend to remain constant as kind of hallmarks of the ethnographic practice. That is engaging in a community over a period of time, building relationships of trust, carefully observing those around you, even as you're participating in their community, being very careful about thick description. Again, this is a description of actions, of activities that are heavily embedded and recognize that it isn't just what you see, but the context in which it happens that is important. And then that reflexivity is really important. This is the idea that you are not lost in your activity. In other words, you have to become fully embedded, but you also are not. You're at the same time fully embedded, but also fully an investigator. And so you have to be able to handle the separation between those two. And a lot of that has to do with kind of the discipline of taking field notes. When you do that in digital conditions, nothing really changes on that front in terms of those standards things. You're observing in online forums or platforms. You're even when you're doing kind of archival analysis, even though that moves you away from the direct participation, it's part of it. And again, you may be interviewing people as part of this as well. That's not participant observation. It is a more traditional interview, but certainly people who do ethnographies will do, usually unstructured or less structured interviews as part of that process, where they are meeting someone new that's in this environment and kind of talking to them about their practices and trying to figure out kind of what that means, just like anybody else who was in that environment might do. You might also kind of go with someone and say, can you walk me through this space? You would have done that as an ethnographer as well. Like if you came to a new place, you might find someone that could be a primary informant and say, hey, can you walk me through it and introduce me to people and the kinds of things that you do during the day? You might do the same thing in a virtual space and find a couple of prime people that could help make you introductions and help you meet people and help you to understand the context in which they are doing what they are doing. Ethics are important in any of these methods, but because of that embeddedness, the ethics here are far more convoluted. And some of the examples we have of people doing things badly are often from ethnographic practices. I don't think I'll tell this whole story, but I will tell you that I told my young kindergarten child about one of the practices that got an ethnographer in trouble, and he relayed this to his classmates and got kicked out of school. So if it gets you kicked out of kindergarten, there's probably as an ethical challenge, that's probably something you need to think about as an ethnographer. Often you're in these cases, and in the case that I'm describing here, where he had convinced it was a question of deception, right? He was investigating a fairly disconnected tribe that tended to have different rules about ownership, especially of food. And so he had lied about what his food was so that it was disgusting to them, so they would not eat it. But you often don't have the same kinds of divisions between public and private. Generally, almost always are kind of coming into a space and being as open as possible about who you are, what you're doing, just as you would with an interview, who you are, why you're there, what you're doing. You need to do that, and it's actually especially important in the case of an ethnography because you are developing a trusting relationship. So being non-deceptive in that space is really important. But what it means is that often this treads across boundaries that would be considered private and public otherwise, right? So that's challenging in a way that many other methods are not. You have to think very seriously about what consent means in this environment, how you protect your informants. I gave some examples here of children who might, in the case of Mimi Ito's work, she was looking at how they kind of used cell phones to carve out social space that was separated from their parents in the same home. How do you protect that, right? How do you make sure that you're not invading that privacy, those private spaces that those kids are trying to establish? In the case of Biel Coleman's work, she's there with a group of people that would be arrested if she gave up information that could identify them or kind of the details of some of their operations. But she's also herself could be. She's. There's nothing there that says that you are immune from arrest if you're a participant observer in these spaces. And so that causes a huge kind of issue around anonymization or kind of certain privacy for people's private lives that might be revealed to you but might not be intended to be revealed to a wider audience. You have to deal with that when you work in an environment anyway, not telling people other people's secrets, not engaging in the rumor mill, except sometimes you have to be part of that mill, the informal and formal networks of power. All of that stuff exists in our everyday lives too, but when you're an ethnographer, you have two lives, two hats in the same body, and so that makes this very, very complicated. Do you quote people? Do you make them traceable? Do you make them anonymous? Do you talk about the actual site, or do you, in some ways, tell stories about the site? In some cases, the ethical way to do this is to actually construct quotes, construct environments that you think adequately describe what you're doing, but then aren't you just making stuff up? So there are some really significant challenges to doing this work, ethical challenges to doing this work, I think much more so than in any other area. And finally, I think there's a piece here about how technology can support this work. I think that ethnography has always, as I noted, one of the key elements of ethnographic research is keeping the ethnographic field notebook. And I won't go into the details of that. There's a whole literature around kind of how that might be done. But these kinds of field notes, transcripts, artifacts, photographs, one of the, especially early on in ethnography, the use of film movies really were an important part of documenting the process. Analytic memos, all of these are kind of really important pieces of how ethnographers kind of square the circle of being two people in one place, right? But I think that digital tools now allow ethnographers to do that in different ways. They can capture and timestamp observations more precisely. They can store and organize kind of large qualitative data sets. They can link their notes together in different kinds of ways, along with screenshots or logs or video media or walkthroughs or recordings. All of these can kind of be smushed together in a single notebook and linked together in ways that allow for later kind of comprehension and analysis. And I worked a little bit with the Mimitos group about this. There you have new ways of, normally ethnographers were a kind of, I don't want to say it was lonely because you were embedding yourself in a group, but it generally wasn't collaborative in the same way. And there's now kind of, there's a system that we use called Deduce, which is a tagging and annotating system that you can start to think about collaboration of ways in which you can collaboratively code observations or notes and that sort of thing. And so it opens up new opportunities for collaboration in ethnographic work. There's also kind of, and this is not just for ethnography, but you can apply some of the analytical tools on the back end to this. Now, again, you've produced this somewhat massive heterogeneous collection of field notes, maybe even from multiple people. Some of the tools that we kind of can use to extract important insight from these work in these field notes, but also in other kinds of documentation. So qualitative data analysis allows for an easier way of transcribing, which we talked about for interviews, or extracting codes, and especially as we get into LLMs that are meant to summarize and extract, again, with extraordinary care to make sure that the human is the center operator in the loop, the actant with information. There may be, and these are all these caveats around the use of these new systems, there may be ways that this can help to identify patterns that you haven't seen, to move more easily between the data and the kind of the theory you're building around that data, or the story that you're building around that data. So there are possibilities here of using these tools to deal with really a broad collection of your notes and figure out how they link together and what the whole picture looks like by using these tools. So why are we touching on ethnography in a course that has this title that I did not choose, but there's nothing computational about ethnography really, right? Except for the use of some of these digital tools. I think it's indispensable because we live in a world of complex, opaque, and deeply mediated systems. And that complexity has to be matched with methods that are equally complex and draw from a bunch of different traditions. When we've used ethnography to recognize that platforms that claim neutrality, for example, when you do the ethnography, you realize that there are embedded values, and those kinds of covert, unconscious values that get coded into systems are hard to get at if you're not embedding yourself within that. You can build metrics that have claims to at least objectivity, but we also know that we have to be very, the kind of deep engagement that ethnography brings allows us to recognize what we may be missing when we kind of flatten the world by using those approaches. And we can look at kind of the stories that don't get told, especially around automation, who loses out, who gets excluded. And rather than looking at central tendencies, ethnography is really good at looking at the variety of experiences. Now, there are other methodological ways to ensure that you're doing that, but ethnography has always been doing that, looking for difference and not just central tendencies, which tends to be what especially statistical methods have driven towards, as central tendencies. So I think that as we make this digital turn, the degree to which we can retain the advantages of some of these heavily qualitative approaches, ethnography, I think, being the sine qua non of this, right? The really key example of a heavily qualitative sociological method. I think the degree to which we can make sure we draw some of those insights into our everyday practices will, I think, make us better social scientists, better investigators, will allow us to identify problems and perhaps come up with better solutions.